Delighted to say on this episode, we have Ryan Bush. He's originally the author of Designing Your Mind and has just written Become Who You Are. He's a philosopher. He's a part-time product designer, very young guy, very inspiring guy, and has this fascinating thesis on depression and the evolutionary history of depression. And so if you suffer from depression yourself or have people in your life who do, then this is well worth a listen. And he talks about how do we lead the good life? How do we experience the opposite of depression? And how perhaps it's not about finding your purpose. Perhaps it's about something else. So yeah, please, let's dive in. Welcome to another episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Ryan A. Bush. He is a philosopher, multiple author, the co-founder of Designing the Mind, and a part-time chief designer at a startup. Ryan, big, warm welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you here. And like I was saying just before we came on, I'd had a look through your book. I haven't read all of it, but Become Who You Are, should I say, and some very interesting ideas there, specifically in the realm of depression, which I really appreciated. So I can't wait to get into all of that. But before we sort of start with the new book, which is available for pre-order, isn't it? Become Who You Are. Yeah, for those people who haven't heard of you, give people a bit of a background to how you came to be writing books about becoming who you are.
Yeah, it's been an interesting path. It started when I was a teenager, basically just very curious about my own mind and kind of tinkering around with my own mental patterns, trying to change my emotional trajectories and just very introspective, very much observing what's going on in my own mind and ignoring most of what was going on in the world around me. But that's just kind of how I'm naturally wired. And this gradually led into an interest in philosophy and psychology and a lot of reading related to our minds and how they work and how happiness and well-being work, the good life. And that led me to things like stoicism and fields like evolutionary psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I was developing a lot of these interests sort of in my free time. And I decided to go to school for design and specifically product design. And so that I felt like blended my sort of analytical interests with my creative interests a little better than an academic path, for example. And so with that thread, I kind of started working with a number of startups designing technology products, software, buildings now. And so at a certain point, I figured out a way to sort of blend these interests and combine my design passions with my intellectual passions, and hence designing the mind. So at the time, I went part time at my job. Took a 60% pay cut so I could focus on writing this first book, and finally put it out there, and it has done really well and brought in an audience and a community centered around what I call psychotecture in the book, which is kind of this process of designing and modifying your own psychological software. And that's led me to create a number of other products and online programs, a membership community, and now this newest book, Become Who You Are.
Right. Become Who You Are. And so, yeah, so what, I suppose, how would you describe the evolution of where you first started with the first book and Designing Your Mind and so on to what you're playing with now in the latest book?
Yeah, it's a good question. The first book was very much centered around kind of the micro habits that make up our minds, the chains of thoughts and biases and emotional reactions and habits and behaviors, and how you go in and actually change those psychological algorithms. So this new book it takes a little bit of a step back and looks at what are we designing our minds for? What's the end goal? How does our actual well-being work? And so Become Who You Are is looking at, what really produces the highest peaks of well-being versus the lows of depression, and how we can use this process of psychotecture that I laid out in the first book to sort of work our way up this scale of well-being.
Right. Well, let's start there then. So how do you define well-being?
Yeah. So happiness has become a word that's just gets thrown around in every way possible, and it's kind of meaningless in some ways. And so what I do is I lay out sort of three dimensions, and I use this model to describe how this works. So if you imagine there's kind of a chessboard in front of you, and there's an x-axis, the left and right, and that represents pleasure and pain. So if you go further to the right, that's more pleasure in your life. Left is more pain. Got it. So then the y axis, that's sort of moving further away from you or closer on the chessboard. This is the loss and gain dimension. And so this is all about, sometimes we will sacrifice something in the short term, sacrifice our pleasure in order to experience more long term gain and success. And what I argue is that between these two dimensions, most of us are sort of navigating our lives on this map, this chessboard, where we're trying to balance pleasure and gain and sort of achieve happiness in this way. And the problem with this is that very often the map doesn't really correspond that closely to the territory. We will, do something that should make us very happy. We'll experience some huge success or, all this pleasure in our lives, and we'll end up saying, "Oh, that's not really. I'm still not satisfied." Lottery winners, for example, they very often statistically they're back to their same levels of happiness a year after they won. And so um, basically it points out that happiness works in this counterintuitive way, and we're using a bad map to navigate it. And so what I introduce is this third dimension. And so if you imagine extruding mountains and valleys out of that chessboard, so it's now a three-dimensional topographical chessboard. This is sort of the hidden dimension that most of us are not paying attention to, that is actually pulling the strings of our happiness, and it's responsible for both the highest peaks of happiness, what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, and the lowest lows, which I think corresponds to what we now call clinical depression. And I think really achieving happiness successfully is all about moving up these mountains, or moving away from the valleys, and not paying as much attention to the pleasure and the gain, except as sort of instrumental means to achieving higher position in the z-axis.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot there. And so let's start with that word eudaimonia. What does that mean?
Yeah, so this is a term that was used by Socrates, Aristotle, and the Stoics, and it's sort of treated as the holy grail of well-being, and it's a much deeper kind of happiness than just how I feel right now in the moment. They talked about eudaimonia as being a state where you are highly approving of yourself, essentially, and the reason is because they all argue that eudaimonia and virtue, or arete that they called it, were intimately tied together. I mean, basically, they went hand in hand at all times. And so it was sort of a given for them that if you act more virtuously, you're going to be more deeply happy and satisfied in your life. And yeah, this led to a whole sort of virtue ethics and a lot of ideas in the ethical space that um, we've deviated from, I think, in modern ethics a little bit. But this idea that our character is the ultimate determinant of our happiness, and that's what we should really be primarily paying attention to as we're trying to improve our lives. Um, yeah, yeah.
Right. And so by developing our character, we develop a greater approval of ourselves, which takes us closer to eudaimonia. And in your model, that's the highest level of well-being.
Exactly. Yeah, and this contrasts pretty well with depression and what we know about depression. So, for example, we look at depressed patients. They, at least in severe cases, they very often believe they are worthless, unlovable, incompetent. They have these beliefs of themselves where they're highly disapproving of themselves. And sometimes this is treated like a symptom of depression. Like depression produces these negative thoughts and beliefs. But I think it's very likely that our minds are sort of regulating our mood based on these beliefs. And that's why, the ancient Greeks thought that our virtues were what was determining our happiness ultimately.
Right. And are you also saying that in order for us to change these beliefs about ourselves, we engage in character development? Or are you saying something else?
Yeah. Essentially, I mean, I think it's a mix. It depends on which stage you're at. I think if you are actually depressed, it starts at a very low level process where you're basically saying, if I'm struggling to get out of bed every day, for example, you want to create an activity schedule where you're essentially gradually working your way up to doing more things that potentially demonstrate some virtue to yourself, right? So, you want to say, oh, I'm at least going to get out of bed every day and take a shower. That's shows my own brain more virtue than if I just stayed in bed. Or, if you're a little higher up, you can say, I'm going to go on a walk and read a book. And so that's kind of what the process looks like at the lower levels. At the higher levels, it's kind of about crafting the domains in your life to bring out more of these unique strengths that you possess. Virtue, I think it has a kind of outdated connotation and kind of sounds preachy to us today.
Yeah,
But it
go to
really,
church on Sundays, sort of. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it can mean anything from compassion to courage to charisma, creativity, right? These are all unique strengths or virtues that you may have a collection of that you've kind of known you were good at since you were young. And if you're anything like me, you'll find that the best times in your life were the times when those had a clear expression. Those strengths were coming out every day, and the worst times are those where they were totally suppressed and didn't have an outlet.
Right. And so I say, so at the lower levels in Europe, it's about just doing something that gives yourself evidence that you're virtuous in some way. And that could be taking as little as taking a shower or getting out of bed. And at the higher levels, it's like inquiring into what these strengths are and engaging in activities that allow you to demonstrate those strengths to a greater degree.
Right. Engaging in activities and looking at the larger domains in your life. So for example, your work, your relationships, your communities, saying how can I craft these to better serve as vessels for my virtues? So, if your work right now, if you're maybe okay at your job, but you're mostly just doing things that help the company churn out profits, there's no creativity, there's no the things that you're best at aren't really coming out on a regular basis, right? Asking, do I need to make changes in my job? Do I need to make a whole career change? Or do I need to leave the workforce altogether and design my own organization that will serve as that vessel to bring out my strengths? And so that's kind of the higher levels. When I started designing the mind, in many ways, I was saying, like, how can I take the 10 things I'm good at and put them together in one place, or the 10 things that I'm passionate about. And I think that's paid off in a very deep sense. I mean, I've never been more fulfilled than what I'm doing right now, specifically because I think it does require my unique personal strengths every single day. And so there is a spectrum here and different strategies along the way, but I think it's all one process ultimately.
Right. And you said two things there. You said passionate and good at. Like, is one more important than the other, or
Yeah, it's a good point. I think they mostly go hand in hand, but really we are talking about virtues. So I guess good at is takes precedence, but ultimately what I encourage people to do is both look at what you are good at, right? Look at your strengths and look at what you admire in other people. Those are your values. And you're kind of looking at the overlap of these things. So for example, if you've got a list of 10 people that you admire more than anyone else, whether that's people in your real life, historical figures, fictional characters, right? You want to really examine and list out what are the specific traits that I admire most in these people, and what do I disapprove of in people. and using those values and your own personal virtues to kind of uh, craft a strategy to become the person that you would most admire. That's the end goal. And so you want to earn your own admiration through your life and your actions, and this is kind of it's all strategic for doing that.
Right, right. And you're very much focusing on looking at the areas where you can demonstrate more of your goodness. Um, and what about the sin? Is it and where does eliminating sin feature in your model, or maybe it doesn't? Maybe it's just focus on the good stuff.
Yeah, it doesn't focus on it for sure. I use the word vice like 3 times maybe in the book. It's mostly about building your virtues, but obviously, if you are doing things that are vicious, if you're doing things that are harming others, this is damaging your own opinion of yourself, right? Obviously, if you're doing antisocial actions, if you're being dishonest in your life, right? These are things that are going to make you see yourself as a dishonest, vicious person and admire yourself less, assuming, which I think is a safe assumption, that you do value things like benevolence and honesty that I think are pretty universal. So I think it absolutely needs to play a role for people who are doing this kind of thing. I think part of it's just that there are a lot of areas where I'm lacking in virtue, but there's not a lot of areas where I have what I would call vices, that where I'm doing destructive, negative things. But I know some people uh, are not that way, and probably they need to focus a little more on diminishing their vices and their weaknesses.
Yeah, because that was my reflection on reading the book. Because I think, to put it in your terms, a lot of my virtual development has come through the elimination of addictions and compulsive behaviors and so on, and I've devoted a massive chunk of my own sort of self-development effort in eliminating vice as opposed to developing virtue.
Yeah, it does make sense for a lot of people to focus on that. I think one of the reasons is that I do want to get away from the sort of transgressive, these are the bad things type of ethics that I think our culture has been immersed in for a while. I think it's often better to focus on your strengths and to double down on your strengths as opposed to focusing overly much on your weaknesses, and that's been echoed by positive psychologists as well. But yeah, there will be cases where you have some vice that's really extreme, that really needs to be your main focus, I think.
Right, right, got it. And then you've got this fascinating idea of social esteem and how that plays into how we think about depression. Yeah, could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I've been studying depression for like a decade now. I've always been very curious about what causes this, and the causes often seem very mysterious. There's clearly a common thread when we look at the data on depression and all these different patients who get depressed. But I've been trying to piece it together for a long time, and one of the biggest questions that has come up in my mind, particularly as I've gotten more and more into evolutionary psychology, is why does this state exist? Why would clinical depression ever happen if it seems to have only crippling effects on us, right? I mean, there's no way that those genes that cause that should have been preserved for, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years, if it only has a negative effect on our genes and our genetic sort of reproduction. And so I started considering whether depression could be an adaptation from a genetic standpoint, right? Is it possible that it actually serves us in some way, or at least serves our genes? And I found more and more, when you look at the data on this, depression doesn't look like a normal pathology. For example, it doesn't get more and more common as we age. Most people who end up getting depressed, they have their first episode of depression in or before their 20s. And so there are a number of other things that sort of line up with this idea that it's not a disease in the same sense that many other uh, of these negative things are. It may have come about for a reason in our minds. And so that led me to this view that depression uh, may be the result of our minds trying to optimize our social esteem, our social status in many ways, or at least prevent us from damaging our social status. Because If you look at it, really, a lot of what the traits that make humans unique, I think, are they came about not for our survival, but for our ability to contend in a social landscape, and to attract mates and allies, and things like this. This is more than likely why we have the extreme creative intelligence that we do, the social cooperation, the generosity, right? All these virtues, essentially. I think many of them came about for social selection, sexual selection reasons. And so, if that's the case, and if these traits really are very important uh, to our survival and our offspring, right, it makes sense that our minds would have built a system to monitor our own strengths, monitor our virtues, and produce different behaviors based on what it finds. And so that has led me to this idea that, well, when people are depressed, we often see that they withdraw socially. They kind of lose interest in putting themselves out there, engaging in a lot of their interests, right? Doing a lot of the things they once would have done. They withdraw, and they get lethargic very often and idle. And so that is one thing that sort of maps on to the possibility that it's a sort of risk averse social strategy. Depression is triggered when you are not finding yourself approvable, and hence your tribe likely wouldn't find you approvable either. And so it says, stop, don't do any more damage, don't put yourself out there right now. Just stay home, don't do anything, because you're not currently approvable. You need to work on this before you get back out there. And on the other side, we see people who are deeply satisfied. They have lots of energy. They sort of want to socialize. They want to put themselves out there. And I think that could be a social sort of exploitative strategy. Put yourself out there while you're highly approvable, and your tribe is going to like you, and you're going to be able to attract mates. And hence, we see this good mood full of energy and interest and motivation.
Right. And so I suppose what we would then expect to see that people, in terms of their social esteem and their social status, by extension, would increase after periods of depression. And is there any evidence to suggest that happens?
No, that's a good question. I mean, I think the main focus is, at least don't do any damage to your social esteem, right? I mean, there are some people who tragically, don't ever really recover from depression, and so in those cases, I think, unfortunately, they didn't find a way to leverage those virtues and bring them out. Or, there's another possibility that definitely needs to be said, which is that we often develop distorted views of ourselves and our virtues, particularly in the modern world. So it's not necessarily the case that people who are depressed, don't have any virtues, or they aren't bringing them out. In some cases, everyone else can see their virtues, but they can't. And so that's
Mm,
another good question as to why those cases happen. But I think it's also important to note that our minds are really what's doing the evaluations of us, and regulating our moods accordingly. And so social status isn't actually the ultimate judge of this. Our own brains are, because we've
yeah.
developed this system in here. And so really, it's most important that we approve of ourselves, and that we appeal to our own values, right? And that's sort of there for social status reasons, but social status is actually secondary from our standpoint, in
Right. It's
terms of
like
our
an
interests.
internal proxy that sort of
E-
helps us regulate amongst the group, something like that.
exactly.
Right. Okay. Uh, and I'm just because I've never had depression, but so I'm curious. Then, do we tend, because what would be consistent with that with people in that when they're in a state of depression, presumably they would be considering, different ways to express themselves in the world, or contemplating their identity and how they might engage in different activities. I mean, what's the sort of work that people undertake during periods of depression?
Yeah. So I think there is some evidence that people who are depressed improve in their social sort of cognition. They do a lot of rumination, certainly, and reflecting on, their own worth and their own approvability. I mean, we see this kind of self-critical rumination going on in depression constantly. I don't think there's as much evidence on strategizing and effectively navigating. And I think one way to think about this is, if you were already able to do do something that would improve your approvability, your virtue, your social status, you would have been doing it already, right? If the
Mm.
brain could have just made that happen, if it had extra reserves of strategizing ability, right, it wouldn't have made you depressed. It wouldn't have needed to. It just would have been doing that in the first place. So the idea is sort of that you're already doing your best, and as a result, a very different strategy is needed. And so I think in some ways, depression is meant to disengage you from the things that you were set on before. It's meant to break, in some ways, your current identity down to a point where you can open up to other possibilities. And so I think that could be a part of it. And there are evolutionary, psychiatrists, Randolph Nessy, for example, who's argued that depression is sort of a give up mechanism, in the sense that it's meant to disengage you from things you are overly set on. And it's interesting to note that we live in a culture that's very much centered around never give up, and so that could play into why depression seems so common, is people haven't been able to give up on certain parts of their identity that aren't working, essentially.
Right. So it's part of the message here is surrender, like surrender to the suppression, almost like it's serving you at some level.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if you can find a different way to harness your strength. I mean, in some cases, I think it's going to vary. There's some cases where people do need to give up and surrender. I think there are other cases where they need to just we have opportunities now that our ancestors wouldn't have had. I mean, if something wasn't working in your social tribe, your social status, you couldn't just like change tribes or change jobs or something. Today, in some ways, we have an ability to make pretty dramatic changes in our lives and our virtue expression, and that can result in some pretty big improvements. So, in some ways, the best thing to do if you're depressed is, if you know what part of your life is responsible for the depression, leave that part. If there's a relationship that's making you depressed, get out of that relationship, get into a healthier one that actually enables you to bring out more of your strengths. And so I think it's going to vary for every individual. I built a program that's very much about identifying the sources, the virtues, the domains in your life, because it does vary from one individual to another, and there's a lot of introspective work that has to be done in order to figure out that strategy to go forward.
Right, right. And I'm curious, right? Have you experienced depression yourself? Have you been put any of these tools to use yourself?
Yeah, so I experienced my first episode of depression several years ago. Very much, blindsided me in a lot of ways, because I had had very high self-esteem my whole life. I mean, I would say healthy high, not narcissistic high, but and I had never experienced like a prolonged funk like this. I mean, I had had bad days, but when I went to bed and woke up the next day, it was always good again. And so it was very strange for me to experience a period of about 9 months where I had a pretty low opinion of myself for the first time in my life, and I had this kind of awful mood that just stuck around, or really an emptiness, you might say. And it didn't improve until some things in my life changed that, map on very well to this theory, I think. So, at the time I was working at this uh, company where I was my role had kind of shifted. Initially, I was, doing cool design, vision concept work that I'm kind of good at and that I love doing. And as the product cycle had evolved, I got to where I was doing more of, um, more kind of tedious engineering drawing work, and I was really not good at it. And so, combine that with the fact that I was part time, I gradually started feeling alienated and like I was, not competent. Essentially, I had one coworker in particular who really took an instant dislike to me, and you know, was pretty kind of sabotaging toward me. And so uh, and I also think that dislike and some of the things that came from that caused me to start questioning some of my interpersonal virtues as well, my likability, and then there was a global pandemic, of course, which is never a good thing to add on top of a identity crisis. So now I'm cut off from a lot of the areas and the communities that otherwise would have proved my brain wrong about the conclusions it was finding. And so for that period, I was kind of just locked in this negative view of myself that in some ways I didn't even think was true. And I think probably the fact that I was only sort of mildly, moderately depressed, a lot of that's because I knew on some level it wasn't true. Some people get so deeply sucked into those beliefs that they are fully convinced of them. Uh, but, but yeah, I think I was at a place in my life where I really wasn't able to see a lot of those virtues that I had always prided myself on. And I started sort of believing I didn't have them. And that's why there was such a quick shift in my mood when I did get out of that job. I did get into another position, another, you know, job where I was now bringing a ton of value with my creativity every day, essentially, and building this business and you know, my book sort of enabling a lot of these domains that I wasn't able to bring out before. So I didn't have a good outlet for my wisdom and my rationality and a lot of these other strengths that now I had a place to bring out. And so it was a total 180 in my mood that happened over the course of just a couple months, essentially.
Right. And so what was there a sort of a pivot point then where you kind of twigged that this is actually about principally about my job and I need to change my job, or was it just like luck that circumstances shifted for you?
I don't think it was just about my job. I think, you know, one of the things that I was grappling with, you know, that coworker who didn't like me. At one point, she diagnosed me with autism. Essentially, I, you know, unsolicited, completely. It sounds like a lovely person, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, and so I was grappling with that as well in my own identity and questioning whether that means I have a disorder and I'm not likable. And I think working through a lot of that too, and proving that wrong in some ways, getting back to where we could go outside again and connect with communities again and see, oh, people do like me. It's just this one person that really didn't like me. And you know, so I think there's a lot of shifts that took place in that short amount of time that changed the conditions pretty dramatically in terms of the strengths I was able to bring out and see evidence of myself.
Right. And what was the catalyst then for you making the move? Because presumably you quit your job. You know, were there any sort of proactive steps that maybe people can learn from or listening that had you get to the place where you could make the pivot?
Yeah, well, so the pivot was a challenge because this was the middle of a pandemic where a lot of companies weren't sure what's coming next. And so I felt kind of like I was trapped there for the first part of that year, even though I knew it wasn't healthy for me. And so I was, you know, working on all these different levels to try to either build out my clients or you know, find another maybe remote job. But I got connected with this one company, Nomad, that was doing some really interesting things and just starting out, and we kind of teamed up on some projects, and it went really well. And then I sort of saw the opportunity to shift over, replace my part time gig with this new one where we were going to be doing much more interesting things that required much more of my strengths. And so and it was all kind of this middle period where I was hoping that this book that I was writing would be successful and then I wouldn't have to have this work. But in this middle period, I sort of made the call that like I still need to leave, even though I was only planning on staying here for maybe another several months. I still need to shift over to this other thing, and so all of it was very beneficial and much needed, I think, for my mental health.
Yeah. Yeah. But it sounds to me like one of the things you had in your the advantage of you was the fact that you had at some level a knowledge that this woman didn't have the right opinion about me. This job isn't right for me. So you had a kind of enough awareness to build a path out of it, right?
Yeah, I think my familiarity with like cognitive behavioral therapy and that kind of thing served me well in not, making this worse, because you do learn when you study these things that there are distorted beliefs at the heart of depression in most cases. And so I'd studied all these distortions well enough that I was, writing a book at the time, teaching them to people, my first book. And so um yeah, I think that was a big part of the buffer that kept things from getting worse, is the familiarity with that and knowing that there a lot of this probably isn't true and it's my brain making it up. I think also my partner was a big part of why it wasn't worse, because I had a very healthy, loving relationship, and I was able to use that as a domain to bring out some of my strengths at the time. A lot of things I'm very thankful for through that period.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, and now towards the end of this book, um, you talk about this virtue vision, seeing your strengths clearly. What's what are we've talked earlier about looking at the people you admire and making a list of those virtues. Is there anything else that can help people to see what their strengths are and build more self-approval?
Yeah, one of the things I encourage people to do is take Martin Seligman's signature strengths test through the Virtues in Action Institute. Really good test. It's pretty long, but there's a brief strengths version as well if you don't have as much time. But it's basically a quiz just to help you flesh out, what these signature strengths are, what these virtues are that I've always sort of thrived at. Um, and it'll give you a list of 5 core things that, in some cases you may not have been very conscious of, but once you see them, you'll be like, oh yeah, obviously that's been a huge thing. You can also ask, friends, ask family. You can literally send a text to, a bunch of people and say, hey, what do you think I'm doing? Like, what do you think I'm really good at? I'm doing this for a book I'm reading or whatever you can say. But actually do it, because you'll often learn some really new, interesting things. I mean, I've had people say like, everyone I asked told me the same thing, and it's one I never would have thought of. And so
Right.
that's another method. You can also just create your own list based on just thinking through different periods of your life. What was energizing me, what was I really good at in this period, and use all these tools to create sort of a master list. And you can organize and categorize them, but really focusing on those deepest strengths that have been sort of fighting to get out your whole life, and using that as a blueprint essentially for where should I go next? How do I uh, let my life evolve according to these strengths?
Right. And when you went through that process, did anything surprise you about your own strengths?
I'm a very introspective person, so I've been asking a lot of these questions for my whole life. I mean, I had like a color coded mind map of my identity at one point, and so I don't think anything surprised me there, but I do think I needed to maybe reprioritize some things that were a deep part of me. So yeah, I think it's very important that I always have an outlet for my ingenuity. For example, if I get to a place where I'm doing more technical work and I'm not able to bring creativity to it, I think that's a dangerous place for me. I also think I need to bring, charm and humor out in my personal life as well, because I sometimes forget about my own emotional needs and interpersonal strengths, and those kind of get buried. And so it's important to keep these top of mind as you're sort of going through your life.
And do you have any tips then or strategies to for people to keep these things top of mind, to keep their virtues, close in their awareness?
Uh, I guess one thing I would say is that we used to have a like church, essentially a place where we went to remind us of the things we care about and that matter. But many of us aren't religious today, and we don't have this thing that we go to every week that sort of reminds us, regardless of what your work conditions into you or what society tells you, like this is what actually matters to you. And so, in some ways, Mindform, which is my sort of community platform, it's a kind of secular, almost like religious community, or you could call it a training gym for your mind. It's a membership platform designed around virtue and self mastery and our values and our well being. And so I think having a community like that, a place where you can connect with other people around these things that actually matter to you, because there's not really another good place in modern society for doing that, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we see a lot of these communities bubbling up now, right? Where people come together to develop themselves. Yeah, we seem to see a sort of reemergence of that in a different form, as you say, which perhaps replaced the church.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to build, more actual in-person versions of this in the future. Right now, I've got an online community, but I want there to be a place that's almost like a gym membership, only it's a gym for your mind where you can go and connect with other people and have almost like group therapy sessions and work on your personal development and wisdom and these things that really matter, but that haven't been built into our economic systems as deeply.
Mm. Now, haven't heard you mention the G word. Does where does spirituality play a role in that? In this, if at all?
I certainly think it can for some people. I mean, I personally am not religious. I was for the early years of my life, but I will I will say that I see religion acting as a major vessel for people to bring out their strengths for those who are religious. I look at religious communities, and in some ways I'm envious because they do have uh, like tight knit communities in a way that most of us don't. And so I think having that kind of purpose, something that you believe in and care deeply about, can serve as a great vessel for your strengths. And again, in some ways, I think we need secular alternatives to that for those who don't believe those things. But I think spirituality can be bigger than just religion in terms of what it means. And I think a lot of the ideas found in philosophies like Buddhism and mindfulness and that kind of thing can definitely play a role in all this. I think mindfulness is an incredible tool for actually observing your mind, observing your thoughts, getting clarity on yourself, and many people describe it as a spiritual experience too. So I think that all this can um, play into a good virtuous life.
Right. But one thing I found interesting in the book was you made this distinction between sort of Eastern and Western approaches to spiritual life, if you like, and this focus, particularly with the Stoics, on development of ego versus
Yeah.
perhaps a desire to let go of ego from an Eastern perspective. Yeah, could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there is kind of what I think of as kind of a cultural dogma today, where we've all sort of accepted, at least those who are into the sort of spirituality, self-help space, that the ego is our enemy, that the ego is a bad thing, and that the goal of spiritual growth and happiness is essentially to quash it, to get rid of our ego so we're no longer thinking about ourselves. Well, if this sort of theory that I lay out in this book is right, and there is a self appraisal system in our brains that's sort of running the show and regulating our well being, you really ideally wouldn't want to eliminate your ego. You wouldn't want to eliminate your own sense of self, because that's what's generating that eudaimonia, right? That's what the ancients kind of said, is you behave virtuously so as to improve your own view of yourself in an accurate way. I mean, not just artificially inflating your view of yourself, but really becoming that person that you admire. That's the deepest kind of happiness you can get. And so I think by trying to eliminate your ego, you're both eliminating the one of the greatest sources of suffering. Yes, because a lot of people who are miserable, hate themselves, and they can't stop thinking about how they don't approve of themselves. So yes, you're not going to hit the lowest low if you eliminate your ego, but you're not going to hit the highest high either. You're sort of taking the batteries out of the happiness unhappiness machine in your brain. And so, yeah, I think the whole spiritual enlightenment, ego transcendence thing would be a relief. It would feel like bliss to someone who had been in a really depressive state. And I think that's what we see in people like Eckhart Tolle, who, have written books about how, he was depressed and he hated himself. And then one day he just had this enlightenment experience where he no longer had a self, and it was bliss. And he just sat on park benches and listened to birds chirp. And I think it would feel like that if you were really depressed and really disliked yourself. But I also think, today there's a very good chance that Eckhart Tolle, has a very positive identity and does have a sense of self, because he's become, someone he's proud of. He's become this guru, this thinker that, is best-selling author. People come, travel throughout the world to hear what he has to say. And so I think this is probably explains the experience of a lot of gurus. They go from, you might say, -1 to 0 to 1 on a scale of happiness, and that 0 is essentially the ego transcendence. It's better than negative, but it's not as good as it can be. And so that's why I think, maybe mindfulness can be used as a tool. Maybe you can go through periods where you step away from your ego, but ultimately you do it to design a better ego. You do it so you can step back in to a strong positive sense of self instead of just no sense of self.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting. And does that map on to the idea of spiritual bypass?
Explain spiritual bypass for me.
Well, so I mean, spiritual bypass um, is effectively using spiritual techniques to avoid oneself, right?
Mm,
To avoid the ego, to
yeah.
avoid negative, and so on, without necessarily developing ourselves or engaging in our emotional bodies and so on. And I first heard the term. It was used by a therapist, a long time ago. She was very much a specialist in trauma release work, and she dealt with a monk who said he'd spent 20 years meditating in a monastery, but finally realized he had to actually come back down to earth and do some work on his childhood. And
Mm.
he'd been in a sort of semi-permanent state of spiritual bypass.
Yeah, I think it sounds like that absolutely maps onto it. I think that's part of what the outcome would be if you really practiced spirituality diligently with the goal of, enlightenment. I think you would be avoiding in some ways your own virtues, your own values, your own approval of yourself. And so I think it's important to, maybe use it as a temporary tool, but ultimately always come back. I like to sometimes think of it as like, imagine you're creating a painting. You're trying to create the most beautiful painting you can, but you're right up close to it. You can't get a full view of it, so you need to take a step back away from the canvas and kind of look at it from a distance, so you can come back in and do it better. But a lot of people, they take a step back, then they take another step back, and they think the goal is to just keep stepping back till they leave the continent, right? So ultimately, you want to go back in and
So your
build that
ego is some
better self.
speck on the horizon, right? That you can barely
Exactly.
see.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go on. You finish your point.
No, I think I about wrapped it up, but
Right.
yeah,
Cool.
going back into that self and building a better ego, designing a better self.
Yeah. Yeah. Really engaging. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Ryan, we've been having a fantastic conversation. Is there anything that we've not covered that you'd have liked to touched on in terms of this idea you've got, becoming who you are, developing your virtues?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've kind of jumped through most of the whole book here. I think let's uh let's see. No, I mean, there are lots of kind of smaller topics we could dive into. I think, for example, one of the areas that you see a lot of people getting hung up on is they'll talk about meaning as being the most important thing in their life, or the most important determinant. They'll say things similar to what I've said about how pleasure and success aren't the real determinants, but they'll say what you need is meaning. And I actually have kind of challenged some of this in the book as well. It's kind of like the spiritual assumption. I think the meaning assumption, meaning is almost a philosophical mystery meat. It gets used in a lot of ways, and no one really knows what meaning means in some ways. And when I look back at my life and I ask, well, what were the best periods of my life? I don't actually find that meaning is that huge a part of it, or that purpose, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, if I think about when I was in college, for example, I didn't have a clear sense of purpose or meaning or what I wanted to do. I didn't have a fully crystallized worldview even at that time. Things were in flux, but I had community. I had, uh, you know, endless opportunities for learning and mastery, and I was able to bring out my strengths really well. But I didn't feel that it was that deeply purposeful or meaningful, and it was a very good time in my life. And I can imagine too a scenario where, uh, I would feel this great sense of purpose, and like I was doing, if I imagine I was like an accountant for a important charity, and I felt it was meaningful, but it wasn't really what I was good at. It wasn't bringing out my virtues. I could imagine being miserable and feeling guilty about it because I'm doing something good that I should be doing. And so I think in some ways this concept of meaning can be a distraction to the actual determinant of the good life, which does, I think, come down to this virtue thing. I don't know if you found something similar, if your experience clashes with that, but I'm curious.
Yeah, no, it is interesting that I don't, I do reflect on my purpose, and I regularly journal on my purpose, and I'll sort of come up and I'll kind of have an evolving sense of what my purpose is in life. Uh, how much of a contributor is it to my well-being? That's a great question. I'm not sure it really is. It's probably more of the other disciplines in my life that, it's having my morning routine, it's doing my meditation, it's getting to the gym, it's eating well, it's feeling like I'm being productive, being creative, which is another of my strengths. You're right, actually. I'm not sure, how much of a role it plays in my overall well-being.
It is interesting because I certainly think that I'm doing something good that's improving life for other people, and that's nice to know. It's sort of a cherry on top, but I don't think it's the foundation. I think I don't think you necessarily have to believe you're enacting this transcendent purpose. I think it's really that's a bonus if you can do that, but I don't know if it's really the heart of what the good life is about. So.
Yeah. But then coming back to my earlier point, I think that the single biggest contributor to my well-being has been the elimination of vice. Because if
Mm.
I'm, from I'm thinking about my, my alcoholic days, if I'm getting up at, middle of the morning and, and I'm hungover and I've probably done a bunch of stuff I was ashamed about the night before, it's, even though I might spend the rest of that day at some level expressing my virtues, it's very, now looking at it through your model, in those periods, not that I was ever really became depressed, but it was very difficult for me to have high self-approval.
Yeah, and that maps on very well. I mean, if you think about it, there've been a lot of attempts in the past to create a reason for us to do the right thing. There was an omniscient judge who was going to determine your place in the afterlife if you didn't do the right thing. There's a karmic cycle of rebirth, based on your actions. And so I think it's interesting to propose a mechanism in our brains that essentially serves the same purpose of giving us a reason to do the right thing, even if no one's watching. I mean, if you find a wallet with thousands of dollars in it and you can keep it and no one will ever know, or you can return it, right? Seemingly, there are no consequences. But the most important person is always watching. Your own brain is watching you, and it's determining your well being. And in many ways, becoming a person you yourself don't approve of is the worst prison that you can end up in life. So, you really need to treat this mechanism in your brain in almost a sacred way, and not do anything that you wouldn't approve of if you can help it, or gradually at least work to become more approvable in your own mind.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it really challenges something I've been reflecting on recently about, we're seeing a lot in the press and so on, especially in the corporate space where I do a lot of work on, mental health days, the importance of mental health and so on. And it seems to me somehow missing the bigger picture, right? Mental health, it feels to me, is a consequence of, from what you're saying, the level to which we're virtuous in our life, right? And so could we think about having, a virtue week or a virtue day or
Yeah.
a sort of virtue officer in companies, right? But thinking more in those terms seems to be like a pretty compelling possibility.
Yeah, a lot of the mental health space and like positive psychology, they sort of focus on these micro habits that are slightly correlated with happiness. And I do think a lot of it misses the big picture. Actually, Martin Seligman, who's the kind of the founder of positive psychology, he actually has talked a lot about virtue, though, and he's basically said, "This is my formula for the good life. It's using your signature strengths every day." And so he has done a lot of studies that have found that if you sort of brainstorm what's a new way I can exercise one of my strengths, and you put that into practice, that's actually a really effective exercise for diminishing depression or warding off depression and producing happiness. So I definitely think, if we had virtue officers in companies and, things that prompted people to really think about new ways to exercise their virtues, I think that would be a really, really powerful practice.
Yeah. Virtue first aider. Virtue first aider rather than a mental
Right.
health person. Yeah. Yeah. It's fun to think about that. Okay, well, Ryan, this has been fantastic. Talking about virtuous life, I'm going to get back and take my son to a horse riding lesson. He's very into that, so definitely,
Nice.
yeah, it elevates my level of self approval when I do something for my kids. So.
Awesome.
Fabulous. All right. So for people who want to, you're interested in joining a community, getting on your programs, it's designing the mind. Yeah, give people the URL and where they can sign up.
Yeah, best place to go is designingthemind.org/becoming. If you go there, you'll see all the links to pre-order the new book, which is now available. We're trying to go really big on this pre-order process. So you can get the Kindle version for only $2. It's kind of crazy. That will not be there for long, but you can also join my email list. I'll send you 2 free books if you do, the Psychotext Toolkit and the Book of Self Mastery, which is sort of a quote collection and compilation and commentary. And so, yeah, it's all at that link. If you go there and go from there, that'd be awesome.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I didn't read the full book, but yeah, I can certainly recommend. It's very well written. It's well sourced. You've got a bunch of stats, and yeah, and I think it's a pretty novel contribution. It's not like I've read the entire wealth of literature on depression, but yeah, I'd certainly not heard the arguments you make about the sort of social esteem before. So yeah, great.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. No, thanks again, Ryan. This has been awesome. Thank you. And of course, yeah, we'll also make sure there's a specific link for the pre-order as well. Yeah. Great.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.